Alright, I've made a bunch of videos with the OP-Z, and today I'm going to do that again, but I'm also going to throw in the Octatrack, and I've been trying to think of ways that I could use both of them together. They have their strengths and some weaknesses, but after some experimentation, I decided to just really and after trying some things that didn't work that I had hoped would work better, where things would get kind of out of sync, I basically put together a recipe that I think works well for me. One thing I'm not going to do in this tutorial is I'm not going to, you have 8 channels of MIDI sequencing capability that you could basically use the Octatrack to sequence individual tracks and play notes from the Octatrack on the OP-Z, and I don't want to do that. What I realized is that the sequencer on here is powerful enough and I like using it, and I really want to preserve like the portability and inspiring results that I get when I can just take this to go and then bring it home to the studio and try to take that and work with it. So by using the sequencer on here with the Octatrack, that allows me to do that. I also found that I'm basically using program changes to synchronize patterns and banks and projects between the two devices. And one thing I realized is that it's actually, for me, more stable to have the OP-Z as the master MIDI clock and master transport, so play and stop. It's just less glitchy, and I'm able to preserve all the patterns that I had created on here without getting some elements knocked out of sync. And you know, the flip side of that is if I change the patterns on the Octatrack, on here I would some elements would like play on the 5 instead of the first note of a loop, for instance, and the only way to get out of that was to basically stop and play again and basically reset the clock. So yeah, what I'm going to show you today is trying to avoid some of those pitfalls. What I really like about the Octatrack is it has really good reverbs and delays and effects that you can throw onto some incoming audio. You know, you can program your own scenes on the Octatrack to basically dial in a lot of cool effects. So I'll show you basically like some examples of that, but that turned out to work really well, and I'd like to expand on that some more. But more than anything, I think after working through this, I think the next batch of patterns that I'm going to program on the OP-Z, I'll program a little differently because now I know I can open it up a little bit more, and if I use mute groups in a certain way, like maybe 4 mute groups on the OP-Z, then I can create equivalent parts on the Octatrack that will trigger those 4 mute groups, and then I can do a lot more with one pattern and have a lot more variety to work from. So yeah, it's changing the way that I would think about programming and composing on here, which is good because I think that offers a lot more flexibility, and if you know you're gonna combine the two. So let's go run through the tutorial, and I will upload the relevant files that that I used in this demonstration today so that you can try it at home if you like. After trying a few different setups, this is the best setup that I've come up with, or at least something that I'm content to work with in maybe a live PA setting or a remix type scenario. So I'll walk through some of the settings and I'll show a couple demos of how it works together. Okay, so for the project settings, I've chosen to have the OP-Z as the master transport and the master MIDI clock. And that's for a number of reasons, but let's see, let's go to System, Control. Let's check this audio. Sequencer I've set to just chain after pattern length. Seems to work fine. MIDI sequencer I've set to CC direct connect. Memory I'm not messing with. Metronome I don't have on. Now let's talk about MIDI. In MIDI control, audio CC in is unchecked. Audio CC out is set to internal. Audio note in unchecked. Audio note out set to internal. Sync. Okay, as I said before, transport, the Octatrack is set to receive transport controls from the OP-Z. The clock is set to receive from the OP-Z clock. And one thing that I found is actually quite cool is the program change I have set to send and receive on channel 1. And so basically what you can do is when you change patterns here on the OP-Z, or if you change patterns and banks here on the Octatrack, basically you can keep it all synchronized by changing on one device. So that has its advantages, so you don't have to manually change things on two different devices at around the same time. So that's pretty helpful. All right, so those are the sync settings. Now channels. Now I have auto channel off, and here in the trig channel I set all these to off. And basically these trig channels 1 through 8 are basically the sample machine tracks. Do you want them to have a MIDI channel that can be assigned or listen to MIDI on that channel? In this case I said no, and that basically removed a whole lot of other sort of problems that I was encountering, where I'm like, whoa, Octatrack just did something funny or made the OP-Z do something crazy, and it was likely because one of these channels here was using a MIDI channel that was either being used on the OP-Z, or there was some conflict there. So turning all these off removes the conflicts and lets you kind of start with no weird MIDI channel assignments on tracks that you might forget have MIDI channels associated with them. Okay, so that's channels. Turbo status, nothing here really. Okay, so let's talk about the MIDI settings on the OP-Z. So as I mentioned before, the Octatrack is listening for MIDI clock from the OP-Z, and also the OP-Z has transport control, so pressing play and stop is going to play and stop the Octatrack. So here in the MIDI setup I have MIDI in enable on, MIDI out enable on, clock out enable on, clock in enable is not set to on, it's off. So the OP-Z is not listening for clock here on the Octatrack. And alt program change is set to on. MIDI echo is off. And I mean, I guess just for your reference, it doesn't really matter in this case. Each track 1 is MIDI channel 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay, so now when I press play, oh, I forgot one other thing here. So on the Octatrack, so I have, all right, so how am I doing MIDI communication between the OP-Z and the Octatrack? Well, I have this USB here connected to a MIDI interface that has a USB in, and then the MIDI ins and outs here on the Octatrack are connected to that same MIDI interface. So that is letting me do the MIDI communication between the two devices. I can't just connect these directly. You need something in between. So that's that. They're connected. Now I also have audio running out of the OP-Z, and that is going directly into inputs A and B. So on track 1, I have added a through machine, and with that through machine, I have selected in A and B, and volume I have cranked all the way up. The reason for that is that the volume coming out of the OP-Z is actually quite quiet. It's not that loud compared to other devices, so I have to kind of boost the volume a little bit through the Octatrack settings. So on the amp page, I have to further boost the volume here, so I have that kind of maxed out basically to give it two levels of gain. And then on the through track, in order for you to be able to hear audio, you have to have a trig on the one for it to engage. Otherwise, you can press play on this, you'll see these lights come up, but you won't hear anything. So this is a common issue that people run into, but the solution is you just add a trig there. So just to demonstrate that, press play. And so on here I have, let's see, this is project 1, pattern 1. Now if so I can basically, now that I have the audio coming through here, there are certain advantages. Like I can have, like I created some custom scenes on the Octatrack. Now that the audio is coming through, well, here I created some scenes. Some delays. So you have a lot more performance flexibility, and you can improvise using effects. The reverbs on here are better, the delays are better. And there's some other random thing coming through. So that's that. Now that I have like the settings in the project menu where I set up the program change for channel 1, now if I choose, let's say, bank 2, pattern 1, and that's going to basically say project 2, pattern 1 on the OP-Z. So it already received that program change message when I punched it in from the Octatrack, which is kind of cool. Now I press play on this, and it's a different pattern. I can basically trigger the patterns as I like from the OP-Z, and you can see this basically follows along here. So the cool thing is I could do like instant switches between the patterns here on the OP-Z, and I can set it up so that it'll play once it's at the end of this pattern sequence. So you'll see it queue up. So that's kind of nice. All right. Let's see. So already I'm able to use the OP-Z in a way that, like, all right, I can still program my music portably and then transfer it, like connect it here on the Octatrack, have time in sync. One of the main reasons why I chose to have the OP-Z, the main clock, is because it's not that easy to change the BPM on the Octatrack. And right now, so if I made this the master clock, if I made the Octatrack the master clock, then the tempo would always be determined by the Octatrack. Unfortunately, the different patterns, I mean, each project has its own tempo that you can assign on the OP-Z. So by having the Octatrack drive that, it was overriding the tempos that I had already kind of saved on these projects on the OP-Z. So I really like the way the sequencer works on the OP-Z. I like being able to switch around and go from pattern to pattern very quickly, and Yeah, so that's why I chose to do that. Also, I noticed there was like a bit of bugginess when I was when you switch patterns. Maybe I can demonstrate it. It's a little tricky. So when you're switching patterns and banks willy-nilly here, sometimes certain things. So sometimes things on the OP-Z get a little out of sync. So like maybe it's like a melody that I'm playing is no longer starting on the 1, it's starting on the 5. And there's no way to resolve it except for like stopping and playing again. So so for that reason, I had less of those bugs and hiccups when I was basically changing the patterns from the OP-Z. So, you know, having it set up this way kind of forces you to think about, well, what if I want to have other gear connected to this whole setup, like another synth, and maybe you want the analog rhythm drum machine all in this mix too. The cool thing is, I haven't tried it yet, but the analog rhythm kind of integrates really well with the Octatrack when you have the program changes set up. If you want to play bank 1, pattern 1 on the Octatrack and have the analog rhythm listening for that message, it can do that, and you can change it and they will stay in sync. And now I have the OP-Z, which can kind of do something similar. I can basically trigger those changes from here and have it translate out to the other machines. All right, so there's one other thing I want to show people here. All right, so let's say I have mute groups on here on the OP-Z for a specific track. And let's say mute group 1. Let's say mute group 2, I take all the drums away. Or I just have this and I take some melodies away. So mute group 2, kick, snare, bass, and chords. Mute group 3 is going to have no drums and no bass. Now, what I discovered is that there's a clever way to trigger mute groups on the OP-Z from the Octatrack, and if you use parts, you can do that. So let's say here I'm going to copy part 1. And I'm going to paste that to part 2. And let's say on part 1, I have a MIDI track here. It's MIDI. It's track 6, MIDI channel 16. And what I did is I used CC number 55, which CC number 55 in the OP-Z is that's the CC number that allows you to trigger mute groups. So based on values 0 through 9. So you have 10 mute groups, 0 through 9. And so I assign 55, CC 55 to this dial. And so if I want, so let's play this. I'm on part 1 right now. And now I'm playing mute group number 2. I'm going to move the dial. And now I'm playing mute group 3. So let's say part 1, I want to have this. And then I will go to part 2. And I want part 2 to use mute group number 3. So now on the Octatrack, I can switch between mute groups on the OP-Z by engaging parts, which is pretty cool. I can use this to kind of perform a few. I can use 4 different mute groups and trigger them through the 4 parts on the Octatrack. And so with the 4 parts, you can basically kind of construct mute groups that would allow you to do like the bass line groove and like a breakdown with no drums, etc., and basically get more variety out of just one pattern. So that, I think, is one of the, it took me a couple of days to figure this out, and that kind of changes a lot of things. It makes me want to rethink how I construct tracks and maybe how I use and construct new groups on the OP-Z in a way that maybe I'll be thinking about how I would perform it on the OP-Z, I'm sorry, on the Octatrack in a fuller sequence. Alright, so we covered sync, we covered MIDI connections and mute groups and parts, and my vote is that OP-Z should be in control of the tempo and transport if you're going to make these two work together. I would really like to hear from you guys. One thing I haven't touched on here is I really want to be using the Octatrack, taking in the audio from the OP-Z and doing some more live remixy stuff, using the sampling functions on the Octatrack. And I'd really like some suggestions. It's not something that I can get some pretty random results, but not anything that sounds really polished and well sequenced and well thought out. I can add some effects, and that's fun, but I want to really like figure out the most interesting ways to use the sampler and the flex machines and multiple tracks, and do some clever routings. So I'd like to do that in a video down the line, but right now it just took me a while to figure out, at least for me to figure out how I could get these two devices to work in a way that was pretty inspiring and not make me bang my head against the wall with all the bugs that I was encountering. So this is pretty stable. Oh, by the way, I'm using the, let's see, I forget the version. It's the most recent version of the firmware for the OP-Z. It didn't resolve any of the sort of the hiccups and sync here and there when I was triggering stuff from the Octatrack. So I'll add whatever firmware number I'm using in the comments. And I will also upload the MIDI settings and the session file that I used here to a place where people can get it. Okay, so please leave some suggestions in the comments. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.